time, kids. It's spooky season. It's Halloween. It's finally here. And I have been working quite an effort into actually making this video. I'd say I'm not putting in the full effort because I'm not actually including the Abbott and Costello films, even though the only one I've currently watched for this review is them meeting the creature from Black Lagoon. I'm not going to count it. It's only like 15 minutes. 12 minutes, it doesn't matter. And I've actually seen the Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, which is probably the best one of any of them anyway, but I'm still yet to watch them meeting the Wolfman, Invisible Man, and the Mummy. I think that's all. I do have like Boris Karloff the Killer up there as well, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I do actually. It's pretty weird. It's the only other DVD I have, but I have, of course, the classic Monster box set. And I actually will be reviewing 31 films. Actually, well, technically, it'll be like 20-something, because I'm not going to talk about Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, The Invisible Man, or Frankenstein. So it's only 3 films, which I realize now I could probably just watch anyway, and it doesn't matter. But I wanted to take more of a look into the serious horror films, realistically. I say that given that there's also She-Wolf of London. Not really it's a horror film kind of, but not really. And The Invisible Woman, which is a comedy, but it's still here. It's worth considering, of course. And there is the Spanish version of Dracula. And I will note, in terms of transfer-wise, these all look fantastic except for Werewolf of London, which doesn't have good sources anyway, so I'm not completely surprised by that. They are all 4K restorations. They look fantastic. However, I did actually watch Dracula, Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, and the Wolfman on their 4K UHDs that I have as steelbooks up on the top shelf. Because I have this set, I have the Classic Monsters set, I have the Creatures set differently. I also additionally reviewed the original Phantom of the Opera, which isn't in this set, but I have since put it in this set, so technically I'm reviewing, if there's 31, make it 30, make it 29, 28. I'm reviewing 29 films for this set, for this video. I might, at least for now, because I want to just film this and get it over and done with, now that I've been watching these films for the past 2 months. I say that basically because I started watching these films probably in August, and it being October now, I have just binged through the second half. So I think I got up to, I'd argue, maybe The Invisible Man Returns, or I'd gotten up to The Mummy's Hand. So I'd only watched like 8 to 10 originally, and then I was like, I'm bored, I want to do other stuff. And then I binged through the rest of these over the past couple of days. It's been an experience. But a worthwhile one in the long run, and if it goes after I edit this part of it, I might add a clip later on talking about the 3 Abbott and Costello films and my thoughts on those. I might even add the Boris Karloff one just because I can. I figure I should at least, because I don't really want to. I'll probably do a post review because I want to be looking at all these films in a ranking list, going from my least favorite to my most favorite / what I think is the best of the Universal Monster films, and do brief reviews on all of those films. I won't go too much into plot. Basically, I'll just try to read through my reviews and kind of try to speed run it in a way, because they're in, again, 30-odd films. Then after that, I'll probably do an extra section just talking about the Abbott and Costello films, because I realize there's only 3 to talk about, plus the Boris Karloff one if I just want to do that for fun. And let's be honest, if Boris Karloff was one of the original monsters, I don't see why I don't include that film anyway. It's still a Universal Monster movie, to some degree. Anyway, let's dive into the Universal Classic Monsters. I'm so excited. So, I won't be diving into what the actual box set looks like. Most people probably by now know what the box set looks like. You get each individual Legacy set. The only different one, given how most of them just look like that, and to give you the details on the back of all the films, a few pictures, and some of the special features, it's pretty decent. Pretty decent. If I take out Phantom of the Opera, I will note I have, of course, put in the BF5 version DVD. This is actually the DVD of the Lon Chaney 1,000 Faces This is the Blu-ray of the 40s version, and this is the Blu-ray of the original. I didn't watch the Blu-ray, actually. I watched my dad's DVD, and I bought the Blu-ray after the fact. It still looks really good, because it's the same transfer, just on Blu-ray now, so, you know. I was considering watching the Hunchback films. I have got both of them now, including I will have the Eureka version coming in as well, which I mostly got, I think, because it's a slightly different... I mean, I think it's the same transfer anyway, but because it has some different special features and arguably better artwork. But I do have the Kino release for the Hunchback, and I have the 70s, or is it 50s Hunchback? Jesus, where are they? Yeah, so I've got these two versions of the Hunchback films. I'm not counting them because they're technically not Universal Monsters. I mean, this one is to some degree, but this one isn't. So, yeah, I just wanted to note that, because I am going to include Phantom, but I'm not going to include Hunchback. I could go into so many different delineations from, I could have looked at all the ones that aren't in this set. I could have looked at the 50s films, like This Island Earth and stuff like that, given the Metaluna Mutant is considered a classic monster, but the Hunchback isn't. But the Phantom is, like the original Lon Chaney Phantom, so despite that not being in this set, it's interesting. So, to some degree, I'm limiting myself into how many that I'm watching, but at least I'm collecting them. Like, I didn't need to get the Kino release of Hunchback. I probably shouldn't, because like a month later they announced the Eureka version, so that's alright, it's at like 30 extra bucks. That's right, $70 on two versions of one film, that sounds great. Alright, let's look at the Universal Monsters ranked. I do believe I had, the original Phantom. Okay, so I have written down a list of 29 films. 29 bloody movies. Let's start from the bottom. We're going to have a poster up here in the star ranking, because that's how we're doing this. At number 29, you got She-Wolf of London. So She-Wolf of London is a 1946 film directed by Gene Yarbrough. Yarbrough? It is 61 minutes long. The set lied to me. The set told me that it was like an hour and 11 minutes. It is not. It is a straight 61 minutes. But the same set also has Bela Lugosi's name written wrong. For like, I think Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, because this is in the Wolfman set, because all the sets, I'm not going to go into the box set that much, but a lot of them correlate films in the latter half, because obviously Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman are in a lot of the same films during the latter half, so they all share a lot of films. The Wolfman set has his name spelt wrong, or at least one of them does. Yeah, it does. I don't know if you can read it, but it actually says Bella with two L's. And down here, She-Wolf says an hour and 11 minutes, which it isn't. So, that's actually Abbott and Costello made Frankenstein, because the Wolfman's in that one. Let's read my review. So I gave this film 2 stars, which is pretty decent, given it's the lowest ranked film on this list and the worst rated film on this list. I guess when Gaslight came out in 1944, I also happened to watch this the same day that the woman from Gaslight passed away, the Murder, She Wrote woman. Yeah. So I guess when the film Gaslight came out in 1944, Universal's response was to make the same thing, but with a werewolf. In other words, the film gaslights even the audience into thinking that this is a supernatural film, when it's not. Now, I don't mind that this isn't a werewolf film, given the twist is rather interesting and obvious enough, like, when you look at it. For example, spoilers for all these films, if I dare to go into spoilers. This one's not worth watching, so don't worry. I mean, none of these are not worth watching, realistically. Any film is realistically worth watching, but then I think of The Human Centipede, and maybe I backtrack. Anyway, there's some gaslighting in this film, and it's pretty obvious because the aunt plants evidence. It's pretty obvious in one scene that the werewolf in particular wouldn't use the garden tool to kill someone. It's kind of there. I would have preferred that the film was more interesting, though. It's rather dull to watch, as it's too repetitive in its story beats, and its characters are not too interesting. I actually wrote that wrong. I love when I realize that I've written a review wrong. It's rather dull to watch, as it's too repetitive in its story beats, and its characters aren't too interesting either. The film is also mostly a family drama, with romantic films that are laden throughout to keep you rooting for the protagonist. You know, the girl who's been gaslit into thinking that she's a werewolf. Yeah, that one. The main mistake is with pinning this as a horror film or even a werewolf film in the title. Universal releasing a film like this near the end of their classic monster roster is just a stab in the back to any Universal monster fan who still cared to go to the cinema to watch these horrors, given, you know, the war was happening. Actually, they're basically just finished by this stage, but, like, do you really care to go see a spooky movie when, you know, World War II? Anyway, or even modern fans of werewolves, or just a modern Universal fan who wants to watch every film in the roster. I'm pointing at myself here. At least the film didn't lie about one thing: it is set in London. So, yeah, it's not the worst film. For an hour, sure, it's not too bad, like, honestly, but the fact that there's no actual werewolf. It even says makeup by Jack Pierce. Did he just put on the makeup on the women? Like, what the fuck? What makeup did he do? There's no special effects in this movie. There's nothing. So, I don't know if people were hoping... Would it be a better film if the woman actually transformed into a werewolf and you get your stock standard werewolf film? It probably would have been a better film. Arguably. Probably more iconic because it's like, hey, a woman who turns into a werewolf. How does that do? You know? She-Wolf of London rather than the Wolf Woman or the Femme-Wolf, or I don't know what the hell else they would call it. But also, it being pinned as She-Wolf of London makes you think it's a sequel to our next film, Werewolf of London, the 1935 film. Yeah, you'd think that, like, what is that? 11 years later, oh shit, they made a sequel to Werewolf of London? No, there is no relation, despite the fact that they keep mentioning in She-Wolf of London that there is a curse on the woman, and I kept thinking, oh, it's a family curse, that means it must be related to the guy from the previous film. It isn't. No one shares a single name in correlation whatsoever. They just happen to take place in London, and people just believe in werewolves in She-Wolf. I don't know why, maybe I missed something, but they're all talking about werewolves like it's a fucking regular deal. Like, yeah, werewolves, yeah, they're all over the fucking place. What are you talking about? So we're up to number 28, Werewolf of London, the 1935 film directed by Stuart Walker. My review for the 2-star film: what if werewolf, but also tea with brandy in it, and also boring? Yes. I have seen this film twice now. I have not cared for it both times I've watched it. The first time I watched it because I had actually, fuck. Did I have the Wolfman Legacy set? You gotta be kidding me, did I? So a bit of context for myself in terms of viewing habits of these movies. Outside of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which I bought on DVD, most of these films I hadn't seen. I had seen the original Dracula, the original Mummy, basically every single Frankenstein film. Actually, every single Frankenstein film, and Werewolf of London and The Wolfman. In all fairness, because I have the legacy sets for Frankenstein and The Wolfman. I don't know why we have the legacy set for The Wolfman, given that there's only really The Wolfman, and then there's Frankenstein meets The Wolfman, and then he just happens to show up in the House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula. And then there's She-Wolf of London, which I never watched. I watched Werewolf of London because I thought it might be important. It wasn't. But all the other sets except Frankenstein were just the standard one-film collection. Here's the Mummy. Here's Dracula. You know, and that was it. I didn't have any other film, so I had just those 4 sets on DVD. The Invisible Man I had to collect separately as a Blu-ray. The Creature in Black Lagoon I collected separately as a Blu-ray, and then collected the trilogy set, and then got this whole set. Fan of the Opera, we had the original film, the Lon Chaney, on DVD. I didn't have the 40s version until this set here. And yes, I do plan to get the 4K release, which includes Bride, the Mummy, the Phantom, and the Creature, which I'm very excited for because I like 3 of those movies quite a lot. 2 of those quite a lot, one of them pretty decently, one of them not so much. We'll get into it. So I don't really have much to say about Werewolf of London. It's relatively forgettable. The print obviously doesn't help, as in because the film print doesn't look fantastic. But it's not an overly fantastic film. It's still got some interesting effects, because instead of painting the werewolf as a dog, it's just a guy who has wolf-like features and stuff. It's very into, like, herbology? I don't know. It's really into plants. They've got their shtick. Like, oh, this guy goes to this mountaintop to find this one plant that can, shines in the moonlight. And he happens to get attacked by a werewolf. As you do. Yeah, I'm not going to go into the plot because it's not too memorable. But they go back to London and he's just kind of attacks women in the streets. It's kind of... These films don't really appreciate women that much. I've got to be honest. There's a lot of misogyny in these films, but I mean, I'd say it's fair enough. It's the times. They extend from the 20s through to the 50s, and they all basically have the same principle about women. They're just there. They're either there to get attacked, or there to get kidnapped, or to be assaulted by men. Basically, trust me. Even the last film I watched of this review of any of these films it's basically what that film was about. It's insane, but that was actually a pretty decent depiction of it to some degree. I'll get into that later. Anyway, let's skip Werewolf of London. Next up, number 27 is The Invisible Man's Revenge from 1944. This is directed by Ford Beebe. Interesting name, or Beebe, maybe, because it has one E at the end, but two E's in the middle. I gave this film 2 stars. This is one of those supernatural elements takes place sporadically throughout the film so we can focus on the plot type of film. However, the plot is dull, the effects don't really make up for it, and it takes about a while to get going. It takes about 25 to 30 minutes, because I've got a timer on my Blu-ray player, which I really like. It tells me how far through the film I am without me having to click any buttons to check. I like that about it. Some people get distracted. I appreciate it. So yeah, it takes about 25 to 30 minutes for our hero to become the Invisible Man, and by then there is so much plot specified that you'd expect the film to be over quite shortly, to mix the revenge with wrapping up the narrative. But there isn't much done. Outside of a bar sequence, which was very amusing to watch, a man plays darts and he keeps throwing it and hitting the bullseye, but that's because it's the Invisible Man who's actually been taken along to hit the bullseye, but they're like working as partners. It's pretty fun. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but in this kind of a film, it's like an Oscar-worthy moment kind of deal. The rest of the film, unfortunately, is quite dull and uneventful. And it's kind of bizarre how much this was set up within the first act, only to be the payoff to be so ineffective. Throughout the whole film, I was even questioning if the protagonist was a good guy or not, given he's set up as a lunatic of sorts, but he's apparently been robbed, like Walter White style, by a rich couple who used to be his friend. But the film decides to just spook the couple and have the Invisible Man focus on becoming visible again so he can marry a girl he's never met. It's just dull and not worth the effort to watch. The prior films do the effect of the invisibleness and the narrative justice, and this film just doesn't warrant the watch given the dull story and uninteresting use of the invisible effects. So yeah, another thing I noticed as well, watching a lot of these sequels, is not just how well do they stand up to the original, but how well do they stand up as a film? What does it do creatively as a different thing to tackle it against the other films? Like, is it worth watching as a demonstration of its practical effects? Because a lot of these are very visual and practical effect films. Again, people in makeup, digital effects to remove a person from being there on screen when they're clearly there, which happens a lot in the Invisible Man films, obviously. To some degree, I really like, because to some degree, there's like, it's puppetry and stuff, but to some degree, it's obviously, they've like, I think it's like a velvety black color they've put on the person's face, and they've like been able to remove it in post. It's insane the amount of effects that they went into for a lot of these Invisible Man films. But there's also an element that, like, you can still kind of see the outline of the invisible person's face, which you think is a bad thing, because it's like, oh, that's such a cheap effect, I can still see him. I like it. I think it's kind of fun, because instead of just looking at blank space because he's invisible and then kind of seeing a vague outline every once in a while where the effect didn't completely pull off in the, transfer, it's like actually you can kind of make out their features every once in a while, and I kind of like that. I find it fun. Anyway, we're moving on to our next film. This is The Mummy's Tomb from 1942. God, these mummy films, they're... If I was to find my least enjoyed series of any of these films, it would probably be the Mummy films. I know the Wolfman films aren't much to go on either, because realistically you've basically got the Wolfman and then Werewolf for London and Shield for London, unless you want to include Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, House of Frankenstein, and House of Dracula. But given that as well, it's like, it's a topsy-turvy one. The Mummy films, on the other hand, I have never found very much interest in any of them. They're not terrible movies, I just don't think that they're very interesting, personally. So that kind of says a lot. There's a lot more mummy films, and a lot more specifically about a mummy, but then I don't think they're as interesting as the Wolfman films, and half of the Wolfman films are fucking crap, so, you know. And I don't care much for Wolfman films in general, because it's like, I would prefer a Wolfman to be not a Wolfman, but to be a werewolf. Werewolves are much more interesting. The American Werewolf in London is fantastic, and like shit like The Howling, I love that stuff. People turning into a fucking dog, it's insane. But people just standing up and being like, look at me, I haven't shaved in a couple days. It's still great effects, I still love it though, so, you know. So, The Mummy's Tomb. I gave this film 2 stars. It's hard... Oh, I should credit the director, of course. Harold Young. This is a 61-minute film, which is delightful, because it's kind of boring. It's hard to argue this is a bad film when it's 45 minutes of the mummy hunting people, 12 minutes of prologue summating the previous film, and then a minute or so to wrap it up, but it genuinely is just a breeze of an hour. Did you care about the cast of the previous film? Well, I should say, did you care about the characters of the previous film? Well, if you did, then you get to watch them in their 60s, and they're gonna get strangled to death by the mummy. If you didn't like them, then better for you, I guess. I don't know. It's up to you, really. I didn't even realize Babe, which is like the name of one of the main characters in the previous film, and one of the characters in this film. It's very concerning because they keep calling him Babe, and I'm like, what the hell's going on? Are they like a couple or something? Like, this is the 40s. I thought they didn't like gays. And the guy's name is just Babe. Fucking Pig in the City or some bullshit. So anyway, I didn't realize that Babe was in the film until he was hunted down and killed. So, rip Babe. I will note that it's hilarious to me as to how much of this and Hand were ripped off in the Hammer horror film The Mummy, which is probably a better film than these two, but they, you know, they all have their perks. I really like that Mummy film. I like a lot of those Hammer horror films. I don't think they're all fantastic. I've kind of usually prefer the Universal style, but, because I think Technicolor sometimes cheapens horror films in a way. That's just a personal thing. Black and white has a different effect. But I do like that Mummy film. This does still emphasize to me as to how boring I find the Mummy films to be. A silent guy in bandages strangling people? Really? That's the whole shtick? Oh, I just shook my phone and I got the Gremlin dude. Look. He's back. It's past midnight, baby. It's going to be a while. And to think I have 2 more to go. Well, at least they're short. You know, they're all like an hour each, which is great. And also, I don't know why this one is called Tomb and not Hand. The titles are in the wrong order, and I know that'll stump me one day when it's important. I guess that's now, because, you know, say, like, for example, if I'm talking about these mummy films with someone, I'd be like, oh yeah, the mummy's tomb. That's where they go to Egypt and they find the tomb of the mummy, and then they accidentally release it because they're actually looking for the tomb that's on the upper side of the mountain and whatever. And it's like, no, that's the mummy's hand. The mummy's tomb is the one where the mummy comes to America, somewhere in the swampy lands. I don't know, kind of. And the hand of the mummy tells him to go kill a bunch of people. You see what I mean? It's fucking weird. I don't know why it's called the mummy's hand. There is no reason for it to be called the mummy's hand, and this one shouldn't be called the mummy's tomb. There's no fucking tomb. Anyway, dumb. I don't know why they did that. Stupid idea. Hi, it's Editing Me here. I guess somehow I'd forgotten to actually add The Mummy's Curse into my list, so I'm jumping this footage in here because it's just easier, I guess, to film it. So hello. So I'm actually jumping in The Mummy's Curse between The Mummy's Tomb and The Mummy's Ghost, because I don't think it was a very memorable film. I did give it 2 stars, so there's your ranking. My review was, finally the curse has been broken and I don't have to watch these mummy films anymore. After 4 entries, I still have no idea what they were about outside of a guy in robes chasing a woman. Might as well have just watched some British comedy from the 70s involving a guy in robes chasing women, as I'd be getting the same level of plotting. Anyway, the horror in that, of course, being a naked old dude in a bathroom, which is also known as sexual assault. So, yeah, great review on my part, isn't it? So, there was 30 films in this. I guess because I double featured those and went basically straight to bed after the film, I'd forgotten to add it to the list. But there you go. So, the rest of the numbers in this list that I'm going to mention are off anyway, which doesn't really matter because I will eventually get to the point where I note about the Abbott and Costello meet the creature in the Black Lagoon. But after that, everything is accurate. So, yeah. Anyway. But that's alright. If that's not confusing, the next one is, because in 1944, Reginald Leborg directed The Mummy's Ghost. I gave it 2 stars. My tagline for this one, which I think is quite on point, is gaslight, gas keep, gah, a mummy. Anyway, honestly, despite the amount of misogyny, this is one of the better mummy films? Question mark. A lot of maybe. It's an improvement over Tomb, given the stakes feel deadly and there's the constant driving force in the narrative, but it's also stuff we've seen before and is arguably dull. Dull is a key word for some of these films. Inconsequential as well, maybe. There's a lot of, mediocre is probably a very good phrase to throw around, but dull is just probably the best way that I could phrase it at the time, because mediocre basically means the same thing. The characters are archetypes and I have no real interest in any of them, and the mummy isn't threatening despite killing more than 2 people in this film. Sure, it benefits from a crazy finale like the previous film, but instead of the mummy burning to death, he walks into a swamp with the love interest of the film, who has become a mummified corpse, which is insanely dark. Maybe the final film will resolve the ending like it's a 4-part miniseries consisting of 60-minute episodes. Let's find out. Because immediately after watching this film, I watched the next one because they're really easy to watch. But yeah, this one, because again, The Mummy's Tomb is basically the mummy going around killing people for the majority of the film. Again, you get the recap of the previous film, you get the 2 to 5 minute conclusion where they burned down a house and it was insane to the point that my brother knocked on the wall to get me to turn it down because of how loud it had suddenly gotten. And then 20 seconds after he knocked on the wall, the movie was done and I went to bed. So it's amusing to me. But The Mummy's Ghost, a movie which I don't know why the fuck it's called The Mummy's Ghost outside of, I guess, Ghost of Frankenstein had just come out, so we just call it Ghost? There are no fucking ghosts in this movie. At least Ghost of Frankenstein has a ghost in it, technically. The Mummy's Ghost, what the fuck happens in The Mummy's Ghost? That's the one where they're in Swampland. I know it ends with, so this one's more specific. A lot of these ones I don't really get the point of them in terms of plot. It's got to do with Clarisse, the mummy, and who has to protect the woman he loved, who he's not allowed to marry or whatever. That classic fucking mummy narrative. You've seen the Brendan Fraser ones. They're just like that, but worse. It's exactly the same as those movies. All of these mummy movies are the fucking same. The mummy gets resurrected, kills a bunch of people, makes sure that no one touches the girl, but half of the films don't involve the girl anyway, so I don't know. Actually, it's just the one film. It's just The Mummy's Tomb that doesn't involve the girl. All the other films do, to the point that this one literally brings the girl from Egypt, where in the previous 2 films they hadn't even discovered her fucking tomb yet. And this one they're like, oh yeah, not just have we discovered her tomb, we've brought her to America. And now we're going to resurrect Curious, and also the main character's love interest, happens to be Egyptian and doesn't like talking about Egypt because she's a reincarnated version of the fucking princess. How cliche is that? But yeah, it literally ends with him, Curious goes to resurrect the mummification version of the woman he loves. She turns to fucking dust, so she just kind of caves in, and then her spirit enters the body of the other woman, who then, gets entranced. He goes, picks her up, and as she slowly gets mummified, because they're meant to use a spell on her, like these leaves that give him life and whatever, and the priest's hand is meant to give her these leaves to make her immortal, but instead he's like, oh, I'm going to make you... I don't think, actually, it's stupid. He makes it sound like, oh, I'm actually not going to make you immortal because I'm going to take you with me and we're going to be free and go to Egypt and have fun. And the mummy's like, fuck you, man, I'm going to kill you. But then the point is not to make her immortal, it's to get her to live, because these leaves allow her to live in this body. Otherwise she will just turn into a mummy, which she does. She just gets all dried up and they go into a goddamn swamp and die. It's insane. Again, when I say insanely dark, it just ends. They just walk into a swamp and the guy's like, fuck, I guess my girlfriend's dead. And then they just walk away. And that's the end of the movie. So some of these movies are just like, that's it. You got 60 minutes. That's all you can do. Anyway, number 24. In 1945 came a creepy film by Eric C. Kenton. A sequel of sorts to his previous film, which actually wasn't too bad. But this time, it's worse. That's because it's House of fucking Dracula. I gave it 2 stars. Where House of Frankenstein acted as both a summation of the Dracula, Frankenstein, and Wolfman stories, and as a conclusion, House of Dracula does the opposite. Dracula lives as if this... Okay, so this one's going to have some spoilers for House of Frankenstein, so I apologize for that, but it is what it is. So, this film pins it that Dracula didn't die in the previous one. It doesn't help that it's the exact same actor as well, which he wasn't very good in the previous film, and he's no better in this one either. Like, he's a little bit better in this one, because he has a lot more... He's got a whole fucking feature to spread himself out. The previous one, he was in it for like 15 minutes, so I guess there's that. But yeah, he perished in the previous film, but he's back, it's all good. The Wolfman, he perished in the previous film, but that's okay, he's all good. But now he has a moustache, because I guess this might be a parallel universe, which I would have been willing to accept until Frankenstein's monster shows up, and they're like, he's just there, they find him in a cave, it comes out with all this mud, and he's hugging a skeleton. They're like, oh, this is the Frankenstein's monster. He was in a swamp with this other guy, and that's the last we saw of them, but here they are here. The Earth must have just traveled them here. And it's like, okay, I was willing to put aside the fact that 2 of these characters died. Like, genuinely fucking died in the previous film. The best kind of death you can get. But then you bring back the Frankenstein monster with the corpse of the mad scientist from the previous film, for no reason, basically, because they really do not use the Frankenstein monster in a lot of these films, to the point that he's basically just there at the end of the movie to destroy the majority of the set, even though they basically recycle footage from a previous film. Doesn't really matter, but still. And it's just, like, for continuity reasons, they shouldn't have done this. They should have just found... They shouldn't have actually had Frankenstein's monster, let's be honest. He's not really necessary. Sure, the main guy who then has a transfusion with Dracula, because the whole point of this film is that it's about a psychiatrist dude, scientist dude, who's like trying to cure people, and then Dracula shows up and is like, hey, I don't want to be a vampire anymore, can you help me out? And the guy's like, sure, I'll just put your blood into this thingy and give you part of my blood so you can become human again. Doesn't fucking work. But then Dracula's also like, oh, maybe if I turn the dial and put my blood into this guy, we'll see what happens. And then Dracula dies, and then this guy becomes like a Jekyll Hyde mixture of Dracula and not Dracula, because he doesn't go around vampiring people, but he also just goes insane, and like he has this whole different makeup look. It's pretty neat, actually. But the Wolfman's just been there the whole time waiting to become human again, and they've got this like, what the hell even was it? They have this fungus thing that they get an extract from that they use to cure the Wolfman of being a Wolfman. Yeah. What the hell else did I write? I do find it hilarious how they find the monster with the skeleton and they're like, oh, yeah, the mud must have moved them from the quicksand and they were buried, that they were buried in, to here, in this cave below our hospital at the end of a cliff. How convenient. But this time we get them all together in one house. This time they share screen time. No, they don't. I don't think Dracula and the Wolfman share any fucking screen time. They definitely, as the Dracula and the Wolfman, definitely don't, because it's mostly just Lon Chaney. He only transforms into the Wolfman like once in this film, which is fine. Actually, I'm pretty sure... No, it's the previous one. The previous film, House of Frankenstein, has a fantastic transition where instead of him, like, stuck on a pillow or standing still and turning, which he does still do, there's this whole part where he goes out this door, you see his footprints, you go behind a tree, and then the footprints slowly become bigger, animalistic, and then suddenly on the front end of the feet, and you look up and there's the Wolfman. Great, I love when they do that kind of stuff. It makes it seem cheaper, but it's also like, it's just kind of cool. It's like an in-camera effect. I love it. Yeah, so this time we also get a female hunchback, and we get a sane doctor instead of an insane doctor. But the doctor is kind of dull and not really interesting as a character until he becomes the Jekyll Hyde vampire thing. The female hunchback is just kind of there throughout the whole entire film. And she's basically the only real scientist because she does all the work. Like, the doctor's like, oh, do this, do that. I want you to mix all these chemicals and do this and do that. She does all the shit. She does all the science. And she becomes a love interest. But she doesn't become a love interest. She's, like, promised to be cured from her hunchback-isms. But she's like, oh, no, you gotta cure the Wolfman first. He's much more important than me. Because, you know, he's a fucking Wolfman. It's just a dull picture that overstays its welcome by merely existing. That being said, I did like the shadow work, despite the fact that the climax of the previous film, House of Frankenstein, did a lot better. Also, Talbot does get a happy ending. Like, he gets cured by fungus. Also, once again, the monster, Frankenstein's monster, is basically reduced to a minute-long rampage and nothing else outside of a dream sequence that the Doctor has where he imagines what he could do with the power of the Frankenstein monster. Oh look, clips from Bride of Frankenstein. Just a disappointment all around and a clear cash grab that has no reason to exist outside of being a dumbed-down version of the initially planned Wolfman vs. Dracula. Which could have been interesting if the, it wasn't the people who made it was like the, not review board, they made the script, they handed it in, the people were like, nah, it's too violent. Then they shelved it for 6 months and then they turned it into House of Dracula. And it's like, they were gonna have Bela Lugosi come back as the fucking Dracula. I mean, come on, that would have been great. Him v the Wolfman. I would have completely not given a shit for any continuity between any of the other films. I would have been like, I don't care. This is, in this universe, it's a direct sequel to both Frankenstein and both Dracula and the Wolfman. I don't care. It could have been really good. I don't know. They didn't do it though. Anyway, next up, number 23, we have House of Frankenstein. No, wait, no, that's not right. It's Son of Frankenstein from 1939. This is directed by Roland V. Lee, which is the final film to have Karloff as the monster. I gave this film 2.5 stars. It may have the crazy characters and the wondrous production design, but Colin Clive and James Whale are sorely missed in this endeavour of a sequel. The film overstates its welcome, having only the energy to give Bela Lugosi something to chew on. And to make it all worse, the film is shot in the most tiresome, uninspired of ways. It's a dull and lifeless film in the end. Also, it's really long. It's 99 minutes. It's not... I don't particularly think it's a fantastic film. Of course, Karloff is still fantastic. The cast that you do get are interesting, and the production design is fantastic. Like, the sets are amazing. Bela Lugosi is great. But you go from Bride of Frankenstein, which is one of the most visually creative films that they have made in this whole entire fucking series of movies, and there's so much life in it, there's so much creativity in it. It's an absolutely balls to the wall, insane movie. And then its immediate sequel is dull and lifeless and boring, and it's just unfortunate. If this was like the sequel to Frankenstein and not Bride of Frankenstein, then maybe, sure, it wouldn't have been such a harsh comparison, but basically with any Frankenstein film, you have to compare it to the original. You can't compare it to Bride, because Bride fucking tramples on all of them. Anyway, it's still a decent film. I just don't think it's fantastic. And to be fair, this is the first film in this list that I would actually suggest that any of these films from here on out, from Son of Frankenstein upwards, are worth at least watching once. I don't think any of these previous films that we've gone through are worth watching. However, the next film I do think is kind of dull, but it's iconic. And this is the 1932 The Mummy, directed by Karl Freund. Friend? I think it's German. I gave this film 2.5 stars. The real horror is all these red flags that Helen Grosvenor / Princess Arkan... Jesus, did I actually... Oh my god. Ank Essen Amun... Jesus. How do these people... That's actually her name. Experiences despite reincarnation. Okay, so when I started doing these reviews... Actually, fuck, this was in April. You're kidding me. I watched it in April... Okay, so I watched these in April to June, the first, 8 movies. It wasn't until the end of September I decided to binge the rest of these, and it's currently, the 14th, so it's taken me about around 2 weeks to get through all of these Universal ones. So a lot of these early ones I didn't really write proper reviews for. The Mummy I've seen probably 3 times now, I think. I'd seen it, again, the only Mummy film I ever had was that Mummy film plus the Brendan Fraser ones. I watched that when I grew up. I rewatched it a few years ago, and I've watched it in this set. And it still is a interesting film. It's iconic. I just don't think it's fantastic. It sets a lot of precedents for basically what a lot of these Mummy films become, and it's basically just recycled plots of, oh, there's this guy who was mummified because he had a relationship with a princess, and, it wasn't, right because he wasn't a king, he's just a fucking dude. And he gets mummified, but, alive, so he's cursed as well. And the princess probably dies to some degree. She usually dies. They usually mummify her as well, but they at least maybe kill her. I don't know. But they probably put a curse on her as well. Then there's a reincarnated version of her, but in the 30s, even though the film's probably set in the late 1890s-ish. Because again, a lot of these films also take place over the course of several decades. The Mummy films in particular. I mean, the Frankenstein ones as well. From Bride to Son of Frankenstein, it's talking about his son, who was a baby in Bride of Frankenstein, and then in Son of Frankenstein, the dude's in his mid-20s, maybe his 30s, and he has a kid who's 6 or 7, and a wife. And it's okay, fine, sure, do what you gotta do. At least the rest of them are oh, it's the brother of that guy, and it's the cousin of that, shit like that. But yeah, so the Mummy films, it's you have the original one, and then they didn't really do a direct sequel, because all the other Mummy films are the Mummy's Hand is basically a remake, reboot kind of thing, and then that's oh, that's basically set when the Mummy was set. But then the next one is set 30, actually, they're probably in their 20s and 30s maybe, so it's probably set 20 to 25 years later, and then from then on, they're all set within a couple of years of each other. Yeah, that's probably I feel that's probably the biggest time jump, but I don't know, it's still only 20 to 30 years. It basically goes oh, it's set in the late 1890s, and then the next one's set in the 30s when the movie's been made. So it's kind of contemporary, but not really. Obviously it's not going to be contemporary because of the fucking war, but, But yeah, the Mummy, it benefits from being iconic. Karloff as the Mummy isn't the Mummy for long enough. Most of the films try to rectify that by having the Mummy be in the bandages. But the thing is, I feel like that's probably where the colour font benefits. Hey, look, he's a mummy for like the first 10 minutes of the movie, but then the rest of the movie, he's just a guy with a hat on and like some like aged skin, and he looks like he's been mummified, but he's just not wearing bandages, and it's actually a great effect, and I really appreciate that. And I think it's probably the only mummy film worth watching. Like, and Karloff gives some presence to the mummy, but the thing is, it's because him wrapped in bandages doesn't do much. But then once he's now, the priest, he has presence because he's a fucking character. The rest of these films make it two different people. He is your priest, he is your mummy. The mummy is played by Lon Chaney Jr. Is he good? How the fuck would I know? He's wrapped in bandages the whole goddamn movie. He has no goddamn presence. All he can do is do this because, like, one of his arms is, like, fucked or some shit. I don't know. That's just what they do, and it's stupid. Anyway, let's move on. The next one I actually had listed was, at number 21, which I now realize we can skip over, was Abbott and Costello Meet the Creature from the Black Lagoon. I didn't give it a review or anything. I gave it a like. It, again, is like, what? It says it's 16 minutes long. You can find it on YouTube. If you ever want to buy this film, don't. Someone will be like, oh, here's the DVD, go buy it. Don't. Look it up on YouTube or find it on the fucking Blu-ray. Because most of these sets actually have the... Actually, no, they don't. I have a 60 Years of the Creature documentary, which actually has the Abbott and Costello sketch. The Abbott and Costello sketch is promotional material. It's basically Abbott and Costello go to Universal Studios, find all these, look, it's the Frankenstein monster, look, it's the Dracula, but the costumes, and then the Frankenstein monster gets up and walks around and scares them, and then the creature comes by and scares the Frankenstein, because, hey, what's more terrifying than Frankenstein? The creature. It's a pretty good promotional thing. It's fun, it's gimmicky, whatever. It's nothing amazing, but it's decent. But go on YouTube. It's really easy to find it. It's not very long. It's not the best quality. It's part of the Colgate Variety Hour. It is what it is. It's just a promotional stunt. Anyway, at number 20, we have The Mummy's Hand. So I guess I did have one mummy film, which I actually thought was better. Yeah, okay. Okay, but this one's different, though. This one is better because it's basically an Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy without Abbott and Costello at all, and I haven't seen Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy yet. So this is a 1940 film directed by Christy Cabane. It goes for 67 minutes, which is also quite nice because it's really short, whereas the original Mummy film went for 73 minutes. So it's like 7 minutes shorter, 6-7 minutes shorter. I gave it 3 stars. I wrote... what is basically... Yeah, this is the first one I watched when I continued my rewatch, because this is the 24th of September. What is basically an Abbott and Costello film, but without the charm, comes The Mummy's Hand, Universal's mummy film that has nothing to do with hands, yet plenty to do with tombs. Yeah, odd name choice for this film. Also, the Costello knockoff is called Babe, so yeah, this really could have been their film if they didn't make one 15 years later. Can't believe it was 15 years later they made a movie. Overall, though, the film is fine. It's a quick watch focusing mostly on getting the characters together over the first 40 minutes, and then discovering the mummy with 25 minutes left for it to awaken, kill 2 people, then slowly chase the leads who aren't aware they're being chased, sort of like a Scooby-Doo episode if the characters were too busy finding clues to find any monsters. The characters are fine for what they are, but the threat of the mummy never feels realized given how chill the main characters are when they discover their murdered friend or the corpse of a guy who hired the workers. So you get an ancient flashback, they recycle footage from the previous film, the curse on the tomb, the mummy walking around, not doing much, and even when he does do stuff and looks at the camera, usually a person he's chasing, his eyes have some weird rotoscoping to them, so they've got this like kind of black fuzziness. It's the only film that happens, but it's kind of a cool effect. It's nice that the characters are focused on given how short the part with the mummy is. And it's also nice that the mummy is a mummy the whole time, rather than in bandages for a minute and then robes for the rest of the film. I can't imagine that these films will be of any interest as I watch them, but this one is an improvement on the original, despite not being as iconic. So, there you go. I've retconned what I previously said. If you're going to watch any mummy films, I guess watch the original one if you feel like it, because Karloff is still pretty decent. And The Mummy's Hand. Because I would actually say The Mummy's Hand isn't too bad. Again, it does take 40 minutes for them to get to the mummy. But for the rest of that 40 minutes, you're developing the characters. It's pretty fun to watch them kind of hang out, do their stuff. There's some magic tricks. It's not too bad. It's not the worst film I've ever seen. It's definitely, probably, in this case, the best mummy film. It clearly is the best mummy film because there's no more fucking mummy films to talk about. So, yeah, okay. It's a decent film. So, yeah. But it depends on how you look at it. Do you want more monster or do you want more character? Or do you want a bit of both? Because this one kind of has a bit of both. There's nothing really of a threat for the first 40 minutes. So if you're expecting the mummy to show up in that first 40 minutes, it's not worth your time. Not really. Anyway, next up at number 19, from 1942, is The Invisible Agent, directed by Edwin L. Marin. Or Marin. I gave this film 3 stars. Despite forgetting about The Invisible Woman and The Invisible Man Returns, I guess because continuity, it doesn't matter, they just don't really discuss those films, so, you know. Invisible Agent acts as a direct sequel to the original film, set 45 years later. Okay, I think this is the longest time jump. God, I'm really putting myself under the goddamn microscope, aren't I? Realizing that a lot of the shit I'm saying ain't making a lot of sense now. Anyway, this film is set 45 years later and puts the grandson of the original Invisible Man into the Second World War to, as you can guess, fight those people that are bad in Germany. Am I allowed to say Nazis on YouTube or do I get banned? He fights the Nazis. It's as good as it gets. The film is actually a comedy thriller, which is a little bizarre given the thriller elements are taken very seriously, like a good spy film should be, despite the Invisible Man element. Peter Lorre and Cedric Hardwicke are terrifying villains and are the standout pair of the film. Together they showcase the terrors of the war and the Nazi/Japanese regime. Despite this, it takes the bombing of Pearl Harbor and Midway to convince the grandson, Frank Griffin, who has previously been threatened by the Nazis, to give them his formula, or his grandfather's formula, and then the American government are like, oh, you should give us the formula. It's like, no, I want to keep it, don't worry about it. I'm sure nothing bad will happen. Proceeds to show 2 to 3 different historical events that changed the fucking war, that made the Americans be like, fuck this, we're getting in this war, let's goddamn stop it. So, yeah, he decides, though, to work with the American government and to use the formula on himself as he dives headfirst into Nazi Germany to uncover a plot to invade/bomb New York. The serious elements of the film are the strongest elements, with the Nazis being quite fearful and constantly ahead with the Invisible Man, given they aren't played as dumb enemies that are outwitted by Griffin. Rather, he's outwitted by them, which allows the stakes to be a lot higher. The weakest parts outside of the obligatory romance, I love that Maria falls for Frank because, despite the fact that she can't see him, when he first puts on a robe, he's 6 foot tall. He's invisible. He puts on a robe and she's like, fuck, you're really tall. And he's like, yeah, I'm 6 foot tall. And she's like, oh shit, yeah, I like tall guys. I just find it funny. Anyway, so there's a lot of comedy, which staggers the film along in the middle section of the film. I understand the slapstick of, hey, this invisible American is screwing with the Nazis, you know, probably during the time it was like, fuck yeah, those Nazis are morons, or let's get the Invisible Man in there to trip them over and stuff, like a Three Stooges sketch, but there's only one guy and it's invisible. So it allows the film to be more playful and eases the tension during the second act, but the strength of the tension was already established, and it works, and that worked to make the horror really stand up. I guess I wasn't really expecting comedic sections of the film, given the immediate tone of the first act, despite the previous entries all having some form of comedic elements. Whether being purposely outright, like in The Invisible Woman, or to alleviate tension of the horror imagery. I don't like how I wrote that line. To alleviate tension of the horror imagery, like in the original film or in The Invisible Man Returns. So, again, those films play with elements of comedy to alleviate tension, like you should do in a good horror film. To alleviate some tension, lighten the mood a little, make a joke. I don't know. Just let it breathe. You don't always have to. A lot of horror films are just like straight horror. Fuck that, we're not doing no comedy. This is straight shit. But this film is like, oh yeah, the first act is like straight horror, the horrors of the real world, horrors of the Nazis and the war and everything. But then, hey, look! He's in Germany now, and he was tripping over some Nazis, and he's making them fall on themselves. And oh, look, where's all the food going? He's eating it. Oh, look at this goofy guy. And then the last half of the film is like, oh, let's fucking kill this guy. It's insane. Still, Invisible Agent is an interesting film, and I like how each film tackles a different subject for the most part, as in each film so far in the continuity or just in the release of the Invisible Man films. Sure, this film removes the continuity of being able to see foods and liquids inside the Invisible Man as stated by Griffin in the original film, despite never shown. And I still have no idea how these invisible people don't freeze to death, especially given how these films don't seem to take place in summer. The film focuses more on the plot elements rather than showing new invisible tricks, unless you count screwing with Nazi soldiers as a trick. For the most part, it's a welcome entry in the series, and it shows that with new areas of narrative to showcase, these films never tire. He says that knowing that the next one, which was Invisible Man's Revenge, was just bad. So, there you go. So, at least some notation there for the Invisible Man films. They're all good except for Invisible Man's Revenge. Because it doesn't help that you'd think that it says, it's an Invisible Man Returns and there's his revenge. They are not related to the original film. It's not the same guy. In fact, it's just relatives. Literally relatives. Visible Agent is actually... Invisible Man's Revenge doesn't even relate to anyone in the film. He just happens to stumble upon a house where a guy has made an invisible formula and makes dogs and cats and shit go invisible. And then he's like, hey, I need to test on a human, and you're a criminal. Do you want to be invisible? You don't want to be found. This will help us. So he does, and then he tries to kill the scientist and get the hell out of there. Fucks around with the people, and he's like, I need to become visible again. Oh, all I need is a blood transfusion? Wow, that's really convenient. It's not great, but the thing is, it's a blood transfusion. He needs a full blood transfusion. He needs to replace his blood with someone else's blood completely so that he doesn't have any invisible blood in him anymore. Which means he has to kill people in order to become invisible. That's what the Invisible Man's Revenge is about. It sounds cool, but it's really not. It's just one of those things where the idea outdoes the actual execution. Anyway, next up we have, from 1943, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, which is directed by Roy William Neill. I gave this film 2.5 stars, so yes, less stars by half than a few of the previous ones, and they're probably all better films, realistically, than this. I'm kind of surprised I have this one so high up there, I will be completely honest. But I did give it a like, so I guess that's a plus. This is the first one I've actually given a like out of all of these so far, except for the Christian Black Lagoon one. You can give likes on Letterboxd if it helps. While it's not a particularly energetic film, it was wise to follow this up as a more focused Wolfman film, given Larry Talbot is more interesting than any other character in this film. The Wolfman stuff is pretty good, from the updated transition effects to the emphasis on the nightmare of the creature, from what it does, in verbal detail of fucking ripping people to shreds, to how Larry wants to die but can't due to his lycanthropic immortality. The scenery and the visuals are adopted from the Wolfman well and are expanded upon when Talbot enters random European country, so he now has a, alternate terrain to frolic in. I do love how they get Talbot to whatever discount German country that Frankenstein is from just by getting him to look for the traveling gypsy from the first film. He's like, hey, there's this one chick who knows what the hell's going on. I gotta find her. I'm gonna travel all around the goddamn globe to find her. And he does somehow finds the one goddamn traveling gypsy. It's insane. Alternatively, the Frankenstein half is where the film falls flat for me. Any Frankenstein film post-Bride is basically worthless to watch. Sure, Ghost was interesting, but nothing compares to the original pair. Having yet another scientist doctor look at the monster and then going mad with power as a way to honor Frankenstein's legacy is just meh. It's overdone. The actress playing the Baroness is not the same one from Ghost, but she is the same cast member from The Invisible Agent, so that's fun, I guess. But she's the same actress in these two different films, but she's not the same actress from the previous Frankenstein film, despite being the same character. Which is kind of weird, but I guess they just did that, why not? But I guess she doesn't do much in this film outside of find a book. There you go. Of course, it's worth discussing the key characters, Frankenstein and the Wolfman. Talbot, his name's Larry Talbot, in case you didn't know the Wolfman's name. Talbot is depressed and just wants to die, which I get, and I feel for him. But knowing how this becomes basically a punchline in the Abbott and Costello movie is kind of bizarre. That's half of that movie is just him being like, I just want to die, and Abbott and Costello being like, oh, fucking Wolfman, what the hell's going on? It's hilarious. It's great. I love how Lon Chaney just fucking kept doing these movies. It's great. Frankenstein doesn't exist anymore. Only the characterless Baroness. So basically, from all of the relatives, all of the sons that he had the one son in Son of Frankenstein who also has a kid. They both survive the film. His whole family survives that film, and they leave. Never to be seen again. The next film, Ghost of Frankenstein, has a completely different Frankenstein who's the brother of that Frankenstein, whose wife probably died, I guess, because he has a daughter who's in her 20s, has some engagement to some guy, doesn't really matter. He dies at the end of that film, but she survives, and she's in this film. So we have the monster buried in ice until Talbot discovers him, and lo and behold, it's Bela Lugosi as the monster, but without the... Okay, bit of continuity here. The previous film, Ghost of Frankenstein, does have Bela Lugosi in it, and his brain gets put into the Frankenstein's monster's body. And despite it still being Lon Chaney as the monster, when he talks, it has the voice of Bela Lugosi, and it's fucking great. It's cheesy as shit, but I think it's great. But this film doesn't do that. Instead, it's just Glenn Strange. Actually, no, it isn't it? No, Glenn Strange isn't. It's just Bela Lugosi, but without the voice. It's just him in makeup, and it looks really weird. Probably the worst looking Frankenstein design, unfortunately. And that's saying a lot, because I don't care too much for Glenn Strange's Frankenstein's monster. He's fine, but he doesn't have much screen time during most of the films anyway, so he doesn't really do much. But he's a better Frankenstein. I think Bela Lugosi made the worst Frankenstein monster, which kind of sucks, because he looks and acts just bad as Frankenstein's monster. I mean, it's probably good for him. He wanted a key role, and he's getting one. It's not a speaking role, but he gets to fuck around in makeup and dress up like the Frankenstein monster, so I guess that's pretty fun, So, yeah. He doesn't have... I don't like the lapse in continuity between this and Ghost, but here we are for the sake of the final act and the iconic final fight. Bela is an okay monster, not too threatening through most of his role until he's supercharged, and then he's pretty neat despite looking awkward most of the time. The fight between the pair is fun and has some good energy to it, but it doesn't really end with a victor, and rather, they're both swept away mid-fight by a flood. And then the big title credits to say "The End" pops up. It's like a Godzilla film, but worse? Depends on which Godzilla film. Godzilla vs. Kong is what I'm thinking of. Godzilla vs. Kong's a lot better, like the original version. I still really like the modern version, but I'm thinking the original version. Anyway, outside of the interesting Wolfman stuff, the rest of the film is hollowed ground until the final 5 minutes of action. Probably the best to watch it until Talbot uncovers the monster, then skip to the second half of the film for the last 10 or so minutes. So skip the second half of the film until that last 5 to 10 minutes. As a fun side note, I love how Dwight Fryer shows up in these films of crazy lines. He was in Ghost of Frankenstein but didn't say much, but this time he's earning those big bucks. So Dwight Fryer was the Hunchback in the original Frankenstein film. And he's in the original Dracula as well. It's pretty great. He just keeps showing up in a lot of these films. He's not in all of them. He's mostly only in Frankenstein films. But, it's not bad. Number 17, we have Dracula from 1931, the original Bela Lugosi film by Todd Browning. Despite its impact on horror cinema, Dracula is very much of its time, yet with enough charm and atmosphere mixed with some unique performances and camera work, making this an interesting entry into what became the Universal Monsters. Having seen the Spanish version of Dracula, I don't really know how to pronounce it differently, it's Spanish. It just has an apostrophe on the A. In October of last year, because I actually watched it on the Criterion channel, that was pretty fun. And rewatching elements of it now for a more direct comparison, I feel they both have their advantages. With the English, it's kind of insane. I don't think I rewatched the Spanish Dracula for this watch, but I had seen it so recently last year that it's basically the same film of this, just longer. So, but they both have their advantages anyway. So, with the English version having a more inviting and mysterious Dracula, where the Spanish version seems somewhat cartoonish, however, it also extends itself to add key dialogue and flesh out its characters and the world, whilst adding more distinct quirks to Renfield. So, again, the Spanish version has additional stuff, but Dracula himself, not so good. Van Helsing is more grounded in the Spanish version, despite his crazy vampire theories, but I do enjoy Edward Van Sloan's version quite a bit more. Kind of a better contrast to Dracula. As in, I think, character-wise, Van Helsing and Dracula. It's a good contrast in the American version. Also, the Spanish version retains some of the camera work, whether coming from the English version, aka the same footage, or just being inspired by it. But the film is let down by its mostly stilted camera work. So, yeah, I'm kind of confusing myself by how I'm reading this. I'm just saying that the 31, the Todd Browning version, isn't as good on a technical scale, because on the same nights, the Spanish crew were watching the film being filmed and be like, okay, we can do it that way and do it that way. Finding different ways to do it, maybe more experimental stuff that just makes it more interesting, I think, visually, despite it being 40 whole minutes longer. However, I prefer the way the side characters are portrayed in the Spanish version, as well as the initial interaction with Dracula, the boat voyage, the way Dracula emerges from his fog-filled coffin, and most of the Renfield scenes. It's a longer film, but it doesn't feel too long, despite the story not being one of amazing interest to me. Overall, despite my occasional preference of the Spanish version, Todd Browning's original is an easy and iconic watch. Whilst not being the best of what these monster films have to offer, its cinematography and set designs create a rich world, a world which allows Lugosi to bring something to the table that makes the villain really shine. So, I think the best perk about this film is basically Lugosi. I didn't really mention him too much in the review, but I don't think there's too much to talk about when you get to Lugosi as Dracula. He's just phenomenal on the role. And even the guy who played Dracula in House of Dracula and House of Frankenstein, even he was like, look, you compare it, you look at the original Dracula with Lugosi, I can't do that. It's too iconic of a role, and you just kind of got to do your own thing and think and hope that you're being scary whilst you're doing it. And number 16, Ghost of Frankenstein from 1942. I gave this 3 stars. It is directed by Earl C. Kenton, who has directed quite a few Frankenstein films. At first I thought it was dumb that this film is titled Ghost rather than Curse, something that is iterated a lot during the opening scene. However, halfway throughout the film, Frankenstein's ghost talks to his son. So I guess it all worked out in the end. Seriously, calling this Ghost of Frankenstein, they must have just had that one scene, And they're like, fuck, what if we call this Ghost of Frankenstein? That'd be better than Curse. Should have called it Curse of Frankenstein. Because it's the curse of the Frankenstein bloodline. My god. Also, I love how the monster is just a plot device that actually kills people, whereas the actual villain is greed, thematically, and Bela Lugosi is Igor. Not to mention, Lugosi voices the monster after the brain transplant, which is insane and kind of hilarious. Just a mental film, and more enjoyable than Sun, which was a snooze. It does lack the creative visual flair that the original two films had, but for a 67-minute runtime, what we got goes by quick, and it's pretty fun. Yeah, I don't have much else to mention about Ghost of Frankenstein. I mean, you benefit from having Igor, who's fantastic. I believe it's Lon Chaney as the Frankenstein monster, and he's fine, because again, you just need a big heavy guy, but the thing is, he also has scenes where he interacts with a young girl, a lot of scenes where he interacts with a young girl, and there seems to be a genuine connection there. Like, I think Chaney's version of Frankenstein's monster just has something else to it, a bit more humility, where Lugosi wasn't given enough in terms of a script, so his character is very cartoonish and he's just kind of like fumbling around. And then Glenn Strange doesn't really have much of a character because he's just there to lay down and pretend to be dead and then wake up and start destroying shit. He's big, tall, and can break some stuff. That's all they really needed for Glenn Strange, which is disappointing because he's an interesting looking creature despite not being as fully fleshed out makeup-wise like, well, basically Karloff. At number 15, we have Revenge of the Creature from 1955, which was directed by Jack Arnold. I gave this film 3 stars. Initially 3.5, but after watching The Creature Walks Among Us, I decided to backtrack this one a little. So, having gone into this sequel, a film I somewhat dreaded, with low expectations, with the knowledge that the creature ends up in an aquarium. I didn't know much about this film going into it. I'd seen a documentary. I swear that documentary lied to me. I have come out the other side in bewilderment as to how much I enjoyed this film. I adore the original film, if it wasn't fucking obvious. I have a Frankenstein shirt as well, but I decided to wear this instead because I love this shirt. It has taken me, like, I have, as you know, maybe, I have a whole video, if it helps, with a collection about the original Black Lagoon, from figurines to movies to posters, all forms of memorabilia. It's pretty great. So, I really like the Creature of the Black Lagoon film, and I've never seen the sequels until making this video. So, yeah, it has taken me until watching every other Universal monster film to get to this. And so far, it's worth the wait. The film is nicely divided into 3 parts. The capturing of the creature in the Amazon, the studying of the creature, and its eventual breakout of the aquarium, and as it finally stalks our main characters on their holiday. The Amazonian aspect was like a shortened and more focused version of the original film, Get In, Get Out with the Gillman in tow. It shows the Black Lagoon and the creature's natural habitat nicely. The aquarium section is a lot longer, taking around 40 to 45 minutes, and it's interesting enough. It develops our leading couple and their romance whilst the characters examine and do tests on the creature. Sure, Clint Eastwood does show up, and he has a mouse problem, but does that really matter? A lot of people like to mention it. If the conclusion of the film had have taken place at the aquarium, then I wouldn't have enjoyed this film as much. It's like they knew that with good sequel territory, you need to do new things. So in this case, they bring the creature to America, they showcase it to for everyone to see, and they study it. All these things are new as new things in this series. We also get to see dolphins play around and do tricks. So, it kind of breaks up all the researching parts so it doesn't seem boring. Anyway, when the creature finally breaks out, it's complete pandemonium. A guy is drowned, the Gillman fights some aquarium goons, and finally escapes into the ocean. It's pretty fun. The final act, however, is where I think the film really does something fun. We see the Gillman walking around the populated area, still close enough to water, but also whilst following Helen and Cleet. The guy's name is Cleet. On their romantic adventure. this part makes the Gillman out to be a more monstrous villain. Not just by killing a dog, but also by basically killing anyone who gets near Helen after he storms into a seaside restaurant to kidnap her. Like, they're dancing, having fun, he slowly creeps up, and he just walks in, goes, "Grah," and everyone's like, "Oh fuck, it's the creature," and then the main guy, Cleet, goes to fight him, he punches him out of the way, grabs the girl who screams and faints, and then he runs away into the water. It's great. I love this shit. And then Cleet has to get up and follow her, and then he's like, "Oh no, where did they go? They're in the water somewhere." I mean, they just swim to a buoy, and he swims after, but they fuck off before he gets there, so... Anyway, then they put out an all points bulletin, and then she gets really insane, because we, by this stage, have already seen that the creature is insanely strong. When he breaks out of the aquarium, he has to break out of a chain underwater, and then he fucking flips a whole entire car, and that car hits the goddamn camera. Like it's no big deal. I just find it funny that it hits the camera. It's great. The final moments of this film focus on hunting the Gillman, and it's very much in the vein of Frankenstein with, the whole mob mentality and everything. But in this case, it's actually a focused police mob that are being led by Cleet. Of course, it ends with Cleet rescuing Helen and the creature being shot at and supposedly dying. They basically just recycle the final shot of the creature falling into the water, probably dead, from the previous film. But that's alright, because then the end title credits pop up. Hooray! Overall, it's a pretty fun film. You learn more about the Gillman to some degree. You see some dolphins doing some tricks, and the Gillman escapes and kills some people with all the aim of swimming away with the woman he loves. And then I also noted now on to the last stand for the creature, because I had the next one to go, which I watched tonight, which is great. I would probably argue of the creature films, it's definitely the weakest. The second half of it is pretty great, from him breaking out of the aquarium to the whole final section. I really like it. The earlier half is a bit dull, but it's not terrible. I still like Jack Arnold's approach to it, and I still think the part where they capture the creature at the start is pretty fun. Number 14, 1931's Dracula by Enrique Tovar Avalos and George Melford. Gee, I hope I pronounced those right. This is a 104-minute long film. It's one of the fucking longest goddamn films that they have. I gave this film 3.5 stars. My quote, because this is from 2021 that I did my review of, and if it helps, it was almost a year ago to the day. It was the 19th of October. I'm filming this on the 15th. So my quote was actually, "Night hovers over us again." I guess I was still using quotes in my reviews back then. Beautifully photographed and with some amazing performances, the Spanish rendition of Dracula can be seen as an improvement over the original, but still with its flaws. For me, the cast as a whole are amazing, except for Dracula, who seems strangely cartoonish in his attempts to be frightening. Bela Lugosi has a charm that helps to drive Browning's version, but Carlos Villarius, I don't know why tonight I'm just not being able to comprehend how to pronounce any fucking names. Despite looking very similar to Lugosi, it just doesn't bring the character quite right to life. I know he's a vampire who's undead, but he doesn't really do it right. Of course, I could compare this to further renditions of Dracula or Nosferatu as a whole, but I prefer to just compare the two, given its similar direction and similar character. Browning's version has never been that compelling of a film, personally, but it's iconic and it has lasted throughout the past 90 years. This version and its additional 25 to 30 minutes of runtime really allows the dread to sink into some scenes and the characters to really shine in others. The benefit of letting the scene kind of just play out longer versus adding too much extra unnecessary stuff. So a lot of it is longer in the element of there are extra scenes with characters doing more conversation and development, but there are a lot of scenes which is a lot of creeping of Dracula, and it's actually really fucking nice. I really like those scenes. It allows the film to breathe a lot more, because they just kind of like, fuck it, do whatever you want, we're basically making the same film but in Spanish. Go for your life. And I really like it. But in the end, we basically have a longer version of a more iconic film. However, the Spanish version is very much so able to stand on its own 2 feet. I'm glad to have finally watched this version, as I plan to watch the 4K of the original soon, which I did. I did actually watch the 4K. By soon, I meant, in this case, 6 months later. Almost, no, not literally, 8 months later. This is definitely worth checking out, either streamed or on a normal Blu-ray, because it's on the Dracula Blu-rays. I didn't have it in my Dracula DVD set, but it's in the Blu-ray sets. And the 4K UHD, it does come in 4K UHD as well. They've remastered both of them for 4K UHD, which I think is so fucking nice. But yeah, I actually watched this on the Criterion channel last October, which I believe it is back on the Criterion channel again, because they've just done the exact same Universal Monster movies. Which is fine, because even last year I watched The Invisible Man, and I did again this year to watch it in 4K, but I watched it last year, which was the second time I'd watched it, because I'd watched it on Blu-ray, watched it on Criterion channel with 2 of my mates who hadn't seen The Invisible Man, and then I watched the 4K. So, yeah. I'd suggest Dracula. Anyway, next up, number 13, Dracula's Daughter from 1936, directed by Lambert Hillier. It is 71 minutes long. I gave it 3.5 stars. My review, not a great one, as in the way I've worded it, says, then Dracula's daughter asked, what if... Okay, my review is really bad. I'm not going to talk about my review. It was one of those, maybe I could make a funny meme kind of thing about how people have that kink of being stepped on. Anyway, that's what this, I was trying to make a reference to that if this film was made in 2022. Anyway, it's bad. Not a good joke. Anyway, Dracula's Daughter is interesting. I'll try to read the synopsis. A countess from Transylvania seeks a psychiatrist's help to cure her vampiric cravings. It doesn't sound like the most compelling thing in the world, but basically the whole point of the film is that it's not actually Dracula's daughter. He had turned her into a vampire, and she was hoping that now he was dead, she could burn his bones to cure her of her vampirism. It doesn't work. So she ends up, which that actually becomes a continuity thing for a later Dracula film. Which one? Technically, House of Frankenstein. If that's considered a sequel to the 1931 Dracula. I don't think you really can consider it that much. Not really. Anyway, so anyway, because that one phases it as like, we've got Dracula's bones here, and there's a stake in it. As if to implement that in the 31 film, the stake was put into his chest and he was still in the coffin. The guy just found the coffin, just took it with him. It's like, hey, here's the coffin, here's the dirt, here's the skeleton. If I remove the stake, Dracula comes back. Maybe, I don't know, but it doesn't matter. But Dracula's Daughter is like, it's outside of, it does have like vague kind of lesbian take as well, because a lot of the victims that she has are women. That's one way you can read into it. It depends on how you want to read into it. But for the most part, it's about this woman who's a vampire who wants to become mortal again. Not particularly to like die or anything, because it's not hard to fucking die as a vampire. But just because she hates being a vampire. She never wanted to be turned, and she hates being a vampire. So she's trying to get this psychiatrist to help her, which is interesting because I think they do try to like chemically process or whatever the crap, but he's trying to like help her from a psychological point of view. It's interesting, and I do think it's quite a good film as well. It's one that not really many people talk about. I'm trying to completely remember what happens, but I don't want to like spoil what happens as well. But a lot of it is her bringing in new victims and stuff like that, but also trying to go to this psychiatrist who she can only go to at nighttime because, of course, she's a fucking vampire, and she's like, I can't tell you I'm a vampire, but I'm also a vampire, and I kind of want you to help me to not be a vampire anymore. Can we get this stuff done? So it's more of like a tragedy in a way, and it's really interesting. It's a good like kind of character study as well. So I definitely suggest it's worth watching. It's a completely different film to any other Dracula film that I've seen. And in terms of most of the vampire films, it's quite different as well, because it's not. It's similar in a way to Near Dark, I think, because this one being more specifically focused on a woman who's a vampire who doesn't want to be a vampire anymore but can't find any way to not be a vampire anymore. Near Dark is, what if a guy becomes a vampire and then he just doesn't? And because he realizes, oh, being a vampire fucking sucks. So yeah, anyway. But I would definitely recommend Dracula's Daughter. It's a different kind of film to what I expected. I was expecting a lot of these sequels to be cheap, crappy fodder, but it was really interesting. It wasn't like, obviously it's still early Universal Monsters. It can't be overly gratuitous because it still is 36. It's only 5 years later after making the original, and I do think it's really well made. So yeah, I'm very sympathetic towards it as a film because it's a different style of horror where instead of being like really over the top or overblown or anything, it's like, yeah, what if maybe being an immortal like creature fucking sucked? And I think it's really good. Number 12, we have Phantom of the Opera from 1943, which is the only movie in this set to be in colour. It is directed by Arthur Lubin and it goes for 92 minutes. Though I still think the 1925 version is better, which that technically has colour, but it's a different kind of colour. Though I still think the 1925 version and even Phantom of the Paradise, yes, are better movies, more entertaining, and even terrifying films. I do think this version of Phantom is quite good. Claude Rains is fantastic as the Phantom, and I like the backstory provided to the character. The costume is iconic, if not better utilised in Paradise, but his scar makeup and overall performance is definitely noteworthy and works for this iteration of the character. The plot is basically the same as the 25 version, with only the start focusing on Rains becoming the monster, and the ending, which is the opera house catacombs collapsing, being significantly different, yet the general plot remains the same. The only really tiresome part of the plot is the love interest fighting for the hand of Christine. She's the one that the Phantom is obsessed with, which a lot of people, and it's kind of read in the film as he's in love with her. Apparently, he's meant to be her father. It is like an original version with a scene that was removed where he's actually her father and that he supports her with all of his money financially because he does, but he never tells her. She's always had this connection with him, but it's never been one of love and affection, one of being like kind of like pity and stuff, because it's like, what if your dad was like a alcoholic dick, but he gave you $50 every month? You know. So anyway, so it's fun to have it in there. This is the romantic comedy part, but it really detracts from the Phantom Christine relationship. I do like, however, that she chooses music over the two men in the end anyway. So I'm happy ending, I guess. The murders are nonetheless a highlight. Despite the simplicity of the first murder and the second one being behind closed doors with only screams heard, the Chandelier Massacre is genuinely tense and wonderfully executed. Like, there's not a lot of scenes in any of these films where I'm like on the edge of my seat being like, holy fucking shit, what the hell's like, people are gonna die. There's this whole part where he's just soaring at a chain and you're just watching his performance, you know shit's going to go down bad, you know the chandelier's going to fall down. You've had all these visual setups of the chandelier being there, and it's like, kind of like, get the fuck out of the way, chandelier, I'm trying to watch the opera. But then it just comes to fruition where it's like, yeah, no, he's just going to cut the chain and it's just going to fall down and crush a bunch of people. It's great. It's not overly graphic as well, you can just basically imagine what happens to a lot of those people, but oh my god, is it a good scene. Visually, the Technicolor is rich. I've heard the 4K UHD looks fucking phenomenal because a lot of people say this Blu-ray looks like shit. I thought it looked great, but I guess I've been watching so many black and white films I hadn't noticed. Apparently the 4K UHD looks really good, so I'm excited for that. So yeah, visually the Technicolor is rich and was a great choice given the 2-strip Technicolor used in the 25 version. It is still bizarre to me how this is the only Universal monster film made in colour that is featured in the Essentials collection, given some of the 50s sci-fis like This Island Earth is still colour but isn't regarded as essential or classic. The overall cinematography and production design is very nice. However, I still think the 25 version is better. So, of course, noteworthy enough, the 25 version isn't in the set. It is technically color because it had, but it's just like a plane of color. Like, oh, now it's blue, now it's red. There is basically kind of properly Technicolor scenes when he's like wearing the red mask and everything. It's pretty cool. Anyway, number 11. From 1944, we have House of Frankenstein. This is a 3.5-star film I gave it. It's directed by Earl C. Kenton, so again, same guy as the other Frankenstein ones. It's about 71 minutes long, which is pretty good. So yeah, 3.5 stars, pretty good. Though not a brilliant film, it achieves more in its succinct thirds, focusing on popular villains, Dracula, the Wolfman, and Frankenstein the monster, all held together by the brilliant Boris Karloff. I forgot that I have actually seen this movie before, because I've seen them all in the Frankenstein Legacy set. I can't believe I had never seen House of Dracula, but I had seen this one, because I remembered parts of how Dracula died, and then the rest of the movie, I'm like, oh my god, I've seen this before. It had been a fucking long time, like probably a decade or something, but still. I had forgotten that I'd seen this film before, which isn't a good thing, but also makes sense given how this is basically a highlight reel of the narratives of the original monster movies. Sure, Dracula is featured, but he doesn't stand out in performance. Rather, he's just there to cause him chaos at the control of Karloff's mad scientist, who brings him back to life in a fit of revenge. The narrative, which only goes for about 30 minutes, still almost half of the movie, has the scientist and his lackey, Daniel, a hunchback, escape in a prison, kill the guy who found Dracula's body, who now tools of it. I guess it's, again, like I said, maybe a sequel to the 31 version, unless you count the Dracula's daughter, then it's not a sequel to the 31 version. Depends. Canon much? I don't know. So then they bring the corpse to a town to awaken the vampire and kill just the one guy who happens to be the grandfather, probably the father, as she calls him, of a woman who Dracula seduces / hypnotizes. A chase ensues. Dracula is killed by sunlight, and those people are safe and free. It literally even has musical cliff notes of like, oh, it's all done. They're all happy now. And then the movie keeps going. So yes, meanwhile our scientist goes to the town of Frankenstein to find Frankenstein's research and to awaken the monster. Given this is a sequel to Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, the canon continues from there in the ruins of the castle. I did enjoy this second half quite a bit, with Chaney's Talbot waking up from the melted ice to quickly explain his backstory in the events of the previous film. Like, this is literally, like, without even flashbacks, which the Mummy films do a lot to pad their runtime. This is like, I was turned into a werewolf, and only Silver can kill me, and I had to fight this Frankenstein monster, but then the water came, the villagers blew up the dam, and we got swept through with water, and we stayed here and froze. He just describes what happens for the past, 3 movies in, 2 or 3 sentences. It's great. So, yes. But then he also mentions how, he hates the curse and everything of being a werewolf, and the mad scientist is like, oh, I promise you that I'll relieve you of your curse. And it's like, oh, good, okay, I'll trust this guy because you'll get me out of this curse. The rest of the film plays out as expected, but with a melodramatic touch. The hunchback falls for and saves a gypsy girl who proceeds to fall in love with Talbot, to Daniel's dismay. The melodrama, though cliché, was interesting to watch and was a more convincing romance than a lot of these films have. I enjoyed and cared about these characters, the post-Dracula, of course, and was invested to see how it would all inevitably end in disaster. Of course it does, and within minutes of most of the characters dying, they basically all drop dead like flies within 2 minutes of each other. The film just ends. Also, Frankenstein's monster shows up, but he's just a prop to go on a rampage within the final few minutes at the end of the film. I will say that I did enjoy Karloff's performance, though probably not his best. I haven't actually seen a lot of films of him in it, especially speaking roles, given that I think this role really suited him as the kind of evil, diabolical scientist, given I'm so used to him being the Frankenstein monster. So that was pretty cool. And in terms of conclusionary stuff, this film ends with Talbot gets shot by the gypsy because she's fallen like that. Like, oh, there's the whole curse of the Wolfman. You need a silver bullet, and someone who loves you must kill you. That's a thing that's only been mentioned in this film. She gets a silver bullet that she makes from an earring. She gets attacked by the Wolfman. Then she shoots him. They both die. The Hunchback is like, finds them both dead. Takes the girl to the mad scientist. Is like, bring her back to life. Do whatever you can. And he's like, no, I'm not going to do that. So then the Wolfman, then the Hunchback kills the scientist. Well, doesn't. He strangles him a lot. Frankenstein, who's just woken up because he's like, hey, this guy's giving me life. Oh, wait, he's dying. Rips out of his fucking chains. Kills the Hunchback in this great shadow play sequence. You see all this stuff happening in shadows. Really fun. He throws the Hunchback out the window, who then falls to his death. Then he grabs the mad scientist as all the police and villagers come by and try to, see what the hell's going on. They use their torches to scare off the monster who's got the scientist in tow. They go outside, go into a swamp, go into quicksand, and they drown. And then in the next one, they're found in a cave. So, yeah, but it doesn't matter. But it's a great ending. I actually really enjoyed it. Overall, the film flies by. It's entertaining. And though nothing is particularly original in it, I did enjoy how they managed to breeze through it without padding really anything to make it dull. Unless you count the Dracula part as padding, but I just find the Dracula part to be the fun little thing that happens, like a prologue-y side romp. That is the overall joy of the film. It's quick and fun and knocks out the main villains of the Universal lineup whilst providing quick backstories for each without making it boring or annoying. It benefits from its anthology-like structure despite better combinations of the characters being possibly in a narrative function, but, this works for what it is. And what it is fun, spooky times with the old gang. See, the thing is, too, is I was thinking, like, oh, what if they were all, like, in the same household or whatever? Like, they're all hanging out and then some guy stumbles upon them, they've got to deal with all this shit. I kind of figured that's what the House of Dracula was going for. But they all go to the one place. Not really, but end up all in the one place. They're just not good. So it's time for the top 10. I was actually going to finish filming this on another day, but I realized that I'm so busy for the next couple of days, and I'm like, I should just film it now. I've only been filming for an hour and 45 minutes. That sounds normal. So, number 10. We have The Invisible Man Returns from 1940. This is directed by Joe May. Only 81 minutes. My weirdly short review kind of saying that a man you can't see can simply return. This one's actually pretty fun. It's a kind of direct sequel to the first film where it's like, oh, the guy from the first film? Yeah, this is his brother, I guess, knows the formula because it was sent to him. He makes the formula work by giving it to Vincent Price. Yes, that's the one. And Vincent Price goes invisible and he's like, escapes from prison because he's been accused of murder. Turns out he wasn't the murderer. The guy who's pinned as top billed is actually the murderer. And he does all this shit while invisible to try to figure out who the murderer is. It's really good. It's fun. It's gimmicky. It had a good fight scene near the end, which is great. Vincent Price is great because you get a great voice for it. So just like with Claude Rains, you get an iconic voice to go along with the role. And you do see him at the end of the film, but I can't really say much else about it. Like, it's just a fun film. It's not as kind of dark, I think, as the first one, but at the same time, they're still pretty similar films. I'd say it's worth watching, definitely. I mean, most Invisible Man films are worth watching except for Revenge. Actually, they're all worth watching except for Revenge. Then you get, so I gave that one 3.5 stars. I don't know if I noted that. Next up at number 9, from 1956, is The Creature Walks Among Us. I gave this one 3.5 stars. It's directed by John Sherwood. It's about 80 minutes long. I'm mostly surprised by what this film sets out to do. It's mostly a moral tale of the evils of humanity, but presented with a purpose that slowly unravels and nicely involves the Gill Man. Tonally, we are immediately presented with a film that feels thematically stronger than its predecessor. The main couple are in a bit of marriage, and our leading lady, someone who hunts for sport and fun, so not someone I'm fond of immediately because she starts just shooting at sharks. I was like, hey, look, I killed those sharks. Doesn't matter. That's like her worst trait. That's like the worst thing she does in the whole movie. But she gets better from there. So she has to fight off two different men from, physical and sexual abuse. Sexual abuse in the 50s standard. She's seen as a prized object to these two men. A husband who treats her like just that, a trophy, and the group's guide who wants her but doesn't treat her right. Yet we are also shown that she isn't two-dimensional, given that she is someone who wants to be treated right, but just happens to, attract a bad crowd. While this slowly develops, we meet the rest of the research team, who only vaguely mention the Florida incident from the previous film, so if you choose to, you can technically go from the first to the third, as they hunt down the creature in the Amazon. The first 40 minutes are spent hunting the creature, which does seem like an awful long time to get, for anything to happen, but we get some good character work, and there's also some decent horror sequences with some nice underwater photography. It's not like the creature doesn't show up. He shows up 20 minutes in, but he's slowly underwater, creeping through, following them, and then they have a whole rough and tumble until they get to a shallower part where he just starts fucking bursting out of the water, attacking them, catches on fire at one stage. It's great, actually. It's a pretty interesting and fun sequence. Not to mention, this is the creature in its classic suit from the first film, because in the second one the budget was a bit lower, so they used a slightly different looking suit, and it's noticeable. Obviously, I would notice it, but it's noticeable. But either way, you get to see him in his classic suit swimming around. I thought it was recycled footage from the first film. It isn't, which is great. And then, of course, he attacks the researchers during their hunt. The creature is really fun to watch during this part. From the underwater swimming to the crafted jump scares as it leaps from the water to attack the men. Honestly, it's pretty cool, and it feels like the creature has a more terrifying presence than we have previously seen, as well as some of the lighting and some of the horror cues, like audio and wise. It's pretty good. I like the roar that the creature has, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't feel cheesy at all. It feels like straight horror. I really liked it. The second half of the film is basically divided into two 20-minute sections. The medical part saving the creature from its burns and creating a lung-breathing creature. It does have lungs, but they end up, because they're like, oh, it's so severely burnt that it can't use its gills to breathe, so we need to try and fix it to make it breathe air. And then, of course, we get to the last half of the film, where the creature is on land and is basically examined in a caged environment. This latter half sees the creature as part of an examination to see how human-like it can be. It can breathe air, walk on land, but can it communicate or simply remove its animal instincts of fight or flight? This is where we see the fruition of the love triangle. By this stage, it's obvious enough that the creature won't be fallen in love with the only female in the film, which is a welcome change both for the series and as it's a cliche of the horror genre. Instead, we see how it observes the relationship between Barton and his wife Marcia, and the handsy guide, Jed. The character of reason is Tom Morgan, who is only kind of a love interest towards the end of the film, but realistically it just seems like he has a better friendship with Marcia because, well, he's not oblivious to how abusive her husband is. But he's also the kind of guy who is able to recognize the behaviors of the creature and is able to basically say to the other characters / the audience, oh no, the creature's not being evil. It does nice things when you treat it nice, but if you don't treat it nice, it will, be hostile. It's kind of like a metaphor. Anyway, this shows true throughout the film, and I think it sticks true to the character of the creature. The creature has been shown to be violent and lusting for love, but is only violent when provoked, and is kind of only in love when the lady is, I guess, an easier target. I don't know, there's not really a... this woman already has two guys going for her? Nah, fuck that for a joke. I'm not gonna bother. She's already in a pretty shitty place. I like how this film isn't if you think the husband and this guy are bad, just wait until the creature starts abusing her. It's they don't have that, which is great. again, like I mentioned earlier, how the whole misogyny stuff, and there's a lot of stuff in these early films. This is one of those films where it's like, no, she stands up for herself. She clearly can't do as much as she would want to because she still has to abide by the rules of being a wife and shit. But, like, she's not actively, like, cheating on her husband. The guy who's all handsy on her is like, she's like, I don't want this shit, you know? I've already got to deal with an abusive husband. I don't want to have to deal with you as well because you're just the same as him, even though he's like, no, I'm the hero guy. I'll save you from him. And she's like, what the fuck are you talking about? You're just as bad as he is. So, it's good stuff. As in, it's interesting. Either way, this film gives you Amazonian horror, deep-sea diving, the classic creature design, and a new humanoid design, which I've seen a lot of figures and images, and I kind of thought it looked a bit bad, but in the film, he looks really good. He has a lot of heavy breathing, because he has lungs, which he's using for the first time properly. He's also usually quite moist. I don't know if that's like a sweat thing or something, but he's very moist. He glistens a lot. It's interesting. The horror sequences are fun to watch, and the final rampage is quite fun too. It's a pretty interesting film that takes itself seriously enough, given the subject matter and the themes of violence. It's definitely not what I expected the film to be, but I did really enjoy it. It has a vague yet sad ending that bookends the trilogy kind of nicely. I don't know. He's humanoid now. He can't go in the water, he'll drown. And the last shot is him walking towards the water at the beach because he's like, I don't want to be these humans, they're fucking assholes, and I want to be in the water because that's my home, even if it kills me. So it's like, it's kind of a depressing ending in a way, but yeah, I don't know. It's interesting stuff, and I do really like the film. It's my second favourite after the, obviously, original, because there's only the three. But yeah. So next up, number 8 from 1941, we have The Wolfman. This is directed by George Wagner, who produced a lot of these films. Or at least someone related to him did, I'm pretty sure. There's a name who produced a lot of these films that's in a lot of the latter half of the Universal Monster films. So I gave this film 4 stars. These classic werewolf films may not be as intense or bloody as the films that would come out in the 70s and 80s, but they always benefited by focusing on mythos and the human tragedy of it all. I still prefer the films that would show disgusting transformations of man into beast, American Werewolf in London being the obvious favourite, but there's a quality to these classics that hold up. However, I love the design of the fabled Wolfman, as it fits with the humanized monsters of the Universal line. And I will always prefer this over Werewolf of London. The cinematography, though, is where I think the film shines. Sure, its sound stages are mostly woodland, but the darkness of the woods, the shadows and the mists, and the overall creepiness is just wonderful, and adds so much atmosphere to the film. Also, yes, it's weird that it's Bela Lugosi's werewolf is just a wolf and not a wolf man, but maybe that's just for effect and budgeting and whatnot, but it's still a little odd, and my only real gripe with the film, outside of Talbot being a creep towards the love interest, but, I guess it's the 40s, it's fine. He just spies on her for a spyglass? Telescope? The Wolfman is a film focused on the tragedy of life and death, presenting horror through ideas, not just as a scary monster. It's a tale as old as folklore, and I like what they did with it despite it not being one of my favourite films in the Universal Monsters catalogue. But I guess it's still one of the best films that they have made. Upon reflection, I do think it is one of the better films that they've made. It's very iconic, obviously, and it's probably of all of the original films, like the first films in each line, I'd probably say it's maybe my 3rd favourite, behind, fourth favourite, maybe. I don't know. I think maybe 4th, because I'd pin probably Creature, then Frankenstein, then The Invisible Man, and then The Wolfman. With, Dracula and the Mummy probably afterwards. Next up, number 7 from 1940, is The Invisible Woman. This is directed by A. Edward Sutherland. It's 72 minutes long. I gave it 3.5 stars, so in terms of quality of a film, I don't think it's as good as Wolfman, but I prefer it. For a film about an invisible woman, I feel like they went in the right direction, focusing on a screwball comedy with a feminist side rather than a gratuitous, perverted film filled with basically what you see in the Fantastic Four films. Again, this series takes a different turn in narrative and direction, having the science become a laboratory mix of vials and machinery that acts as an inciting incident for the whole plot. Our heroine, Kitty, Virginia Bruce, is a model and wants to be invisible to get revenge on her controlling boss and to help her female colleagues. Meanwhile, the inventor of the invisible machine needs a test subject to become invisible to warrant his funding from a rich lawyer who has now gone broke, but that's not really touched upon in the film, outside of the general idea of selling the inventor's inventions to be rich. The ad that the inventor places in the paper attracts the attention of Kitty, but also a mob boss, and of course hijinks ensue. The film never takes a sexualized approach. From the moment the inventor emphasizes that his housemaid should be present when Kitty undresses, to the moment Kitty enacts revenge on her boss. All through to the romance that blooms in the film because the lawyer and Kitty hate, then love each other. Screwball comedy stuff. The comedy's fun, from the clumsy butler to the mobmen, and even the antics from the inventor. It's just good fun, and I like how these films are just having fun with the idea of making the person invisible. It's not a sequel or related to the previous two films, with Returns being a sequel that acts on the events of the first film, but utilizing that only as a reason for the invisibility serum to exist, whilst being original of its own narrative design. I have yet to obviously finish this series by the time I wrote this review, with Invisible Agent Raven and Abbott and Costello film to go, but so far this is my favourite Universal Monster series, even if this isn't my favourite monster. Also, the effects works is still very fun, especially when Kitty beats up goons with a hammer like she's in a Mario game. There's not too much to mention about The Invisible Woman. I think a lot of people think it's a very cheesy, stupid film, but I think you look at the first two films, they're like, the first one's a sci-fi horror, the second one is like a crime horror, more of a sci-fi crime film in a way, sci-fi because he goes invisible, but like with the elements of horror, but mostly a crime film. The third one is just it's a goofy screwball comedy. You get the mob boss who lives in Mexico. They actually use a machine to turn people invisible rather than a serum, but it's a mixture. You inject the serum, go behind the machine activates the serum and you go invisible. And they've got a great gag at the end with an invisible baby, so it's pretty fun. Number 6, from 1925, we have The Phantom of the Opera, which I gave 4 stars. A classic, actually I should probably mention, directed by Rupert Julian. It's 101 minutes long. A classic of its own right, and a film that's taken me years to finally get around to watching, but for a purpose as I plan to watch all the Universal Monsters films to the best of my ability. The Phantom of the Opera is a classic that is buried below its musical remakes. I viewed this film from my dad's DVD copy, which features the shorter 94-minute colorized version from the Eastman house print, with the 1930 remastered score/sound effects track, aka the one I watched. On the second disc is what remains of the original 107-minute long cut, which is only really worth skimming through given the quality of what remains of the print. The original black and white does look amazing, and it features additional scenes, as well as the different arrangement of the scenes from the 94-minute cut, which is interesting. But despite my occasional purist attitude, I am happier having viewed this shorter version. Overall, I was amazed by Chaney's performance and the sets/costume design. The Technicolor and the color tints add a different but welcome value to the already nice-looking print. A solid black and white remaster of the same print would also look amazing, but given the age of the film, I'm not too fussed with the version that I ended up watching. There's not too much to mention about this film. Color-wise, it looks, again, it's that kind of two-stripe Technicolor and everything, two-strip Technicolor. The costuming, the practical effects, the look of, like, what the whole entire place looks like. There's a documentary that is in the 1943 Phantom film, which dives a lot into that original 25 version and how much of it was, like, drawn up before it was actually done, and it looks spectacular. It's a great-looking film. Chaney's fantastic. It's a silent film, which is worth noting, of course, but it's pretty good. I think it's a good contrast to the 1943 version, and of course there are a plentitude of Phantom films and productions and such. But for the most part, I think this is a classic and iconic. I can't imagine a lot of people watching it these days. Don't even know if they'd watch the bloody 43 version, but yeah, I still think this one's really good and totally worth watching. Like, maybe just the once. I wouldn't personally suggest the longer version, because again, I skimmed through a lot of that because it looks identical. It's just that they've added scenes here and there which we just don't have the print quality version of, because the prints are really long, old, and degraded and stuff. I mean, the film's almost 100 years old. So, yeah. But it's still a really fucking top film, and the makeup effects, the Lon Chaney effects are amazing. Next up, we have... from 1943, we have Son of Dracula by Robert Sidmark. This is an 18-minute film and actually has Lon Chaney Jr. as Dracula. For a film that initially seemed like a blatant excuse for a way to continue another classic Universal monster, Son of Dracula proves to be much like Dracula's Daughter, a welcome advancement on the original. Now, I'm no stranger to thinking the Lugosi version is a bit weak and dull, mostly due to the technical limitations above all else, but it is iconic and has a lasting legacy. Dracula is a character that is played with a distinct charm by Lugosi, and is obviously his most defining role. The Spanish version is an improvement on the American version, if only in performance and added depth of character, with minor additions to the effects just through practice and an eye for improvement over the dailies. However, that film lacks a good Dracula performance, as it is rather cartoony compared to how the rest of the cast plays the film rather straight. Dracula's Daughter is an improvement again, though mostly through the focus of the film as a tragedy of the leading lady, Maria Zaleska. It doesn't do much to advance the technical effects of a vampire film, but its themes and characters were very interesting to me. Finally, we come to Son of Dracula, the last Dracula film in the Universal lineup that solely relies on the one monster. Though not a perfect film, it is a film that takes its time and isn't afraid for the characters to discuss what is happening as a way to continue the plot, and to keep audiences up to date with how everything works. It's a visual experience, utilising some wonderful effects from the classic Battle on a Wire to new misty effects, not to mention how the Count rises from the lake. Iconic scene. Wonderful stuff. Chaney is really good in this iteration of Dracula. Though the posters make him look goofy, I think he did the character really well. Much like with his human roles, I think, given, when he's dressed up like the Mummy or Frankenstein's monster, he doesn't really have much to do. But when he's actually portrayed as a human, even if it's a human that turns into a monster, I think he does it really well. As Dracula, as the Wolfman, he's really good in those roles. And I think this is a good dichotomy to his Wolfman role, which is a much more tragic role. This one, he's a completely different presence, and he has a completely different presence that is, to an element, horrifying, but also, alluring as well. He does Dracula well, I gotta say. The supporting cast are wonderful as well, from Catherine Caldwell, who's played by Albritton, as the seductive bride with a secret agenda, to Professor Laszlo and Dr. Brewster, figuring out Dracula's true nature and the plan to destroy him. It's a Southern Gothic that utilises its environment well, and it has a perpetual mystery that develops alongside the characters, and nothing feels wasted. Sure, there are some dated social stuff from the plantation to the casual sexism early in the film, but it's not too distracting, and does, to some degree, represents the place and the period. Overall, I'm surprised as to how much I've liked these Dracula films, given my lack of love for the 1931 film. I don't hate it, it's just that I don't like it as much as a lot of other films that exist, especially a lot more Universal films that have come since. But, technical limitations and the such. Where the Invisible Man film started strong and continued well, until the last one, Frankenstein started very strong with two classics, but then becoming repetitive and formulaic. The Mummy films just, existing. The Dracula films have only improved with each film, for Universal and in modern adaptations of both the Dracula story and the vampire mythos. So yeah, I really like this film. I think Dracula has some solid entries. The original is a classic. The Spanish version is an improvement. The Dracula's Daughter is an interesting film, and Dracula and Son of Dracula is really good as well. I think they all cascade as better than the previous one. So House of Dracula fucking sucks, but the rest of them are really good. Number 4. So now we're in the top 4. I know, Son of Dracula is number 5. How crazy. I've actually reviewed this twice. I reviewed it back in 2019 when I introduced it to my girlfriend. And most recently, I actually gave it 5 stars initially, but I've reverted back to 4.5 stars as of the 22nd of April 2022, of all the days to watch the film. And I just said, almost the perfect picture, just missing something. I watched it in 4K. I think that was meant to be a joke about the bride not being in it. But it misses because it doesn't have a score. Again, a lot of the early films really needed that music to make the eerie elements work. It still is an iconic film. And sorry, did I mention this was Frankenstein from 1931, directed by James Whale? I'm sorry. It's a 71-minute film. It lacks, because of the obvious sound stages and the lack of a score, but it makes up for it with a terrific story, fantastic cast and director. James Whale, Boris Karloff, Colin Clive, they're all fucking brilliant. I know James Whale's the director. But yeah, I really like this film. The 4K looks immaculate. There's not really much else to say. It's a fucking banger. Frankenstein's a classic film. It's a must-watch horror film. It's just worth watching. If you haven't seen it, I prefer these Frankenstein films over most Frankenstein films that have been released since. I don't think I've enjoyed any Frankenstein films as much as the original 2 James Whale films. And I do even plan to get the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the Kenneth Branagh one. I might. There's a sale on right now, but I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to just move on because Frankenstein's amazing, and it seems kind of insane that that's not number 1, but we're getting there. Number 3, with 4.5 stars, is, drumroll, The Invisible Man, directed by James Whale in 1933. I've actually reviewed this twice. Interestingly, the first time I watched it, I gave it 3 stars. This is the first time I watched it with a review. The first time I watched it, I really liked it. The second time, I gave it 3 stars. But I watched it on the Criterion channel on a group watch, and we kind of went with the vibe with it. Spent too much of this movie questioning what things will look like when they're inside the Invisible Man, and we aren't just talking food. So, people can sometimes ruin the experience. But I rewatched it this year on 4K. Looks fantastic. Gave it 4.5 stars. Said maybe all you need is a crazy dude going crazy because he's invisible, and that's the film. Also, watching this without questioning what things will look like inside him when they're inside him and not just food makes for a more interesting watch, to the degree of focusing on what's actually important in the film and not just probably weird sex stuff. The effects are fantastic. The fucking crazy guy, Claude Rains, going bananas because he's invisible. I love it. I love how it's just a guy dressed up in cloaks to begin with. It doesn't show him turning invisible. It's just, he's there, he's invisible, but he's in these robes, you don't know what he looks like, and then suddenly he takes them off and you get these amazing effects. So, the effects were improved over time with each subsequent sequel. That is true. Sometimes they weren't. Most of the time they were. But for the most part, I really like this film. I think it does have a score. I mean, I don't really know, but I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it was just like the early ones that didn't have a score in like Frankenstein and Dracula. But yeah, no, I really like this one. It's one of my favorites. I don't really have much to say about these ones that are at the very top of the list. But in number 2 spot, can you guess which one it is? I've reviewed it twice now. Initially 4 stars, then 4.5 stars. I don't even know which one. Actually, that wasn't even the first time I watched it, because, yeah, true. Insane. Alright, so I've actually got 2 different reviews on my letterbox for it. I've watched it prior to 2021. This is the creature from the Black Lagoon. My initial 4-star review, I said, a favourite creature in a film that, despite its 50s sci-fi schlocky nature, stands strong as a solid creature feature in an overall horror film. Seen this for the second time, I was initially meant to see it in 3D at the cinema screening a few months ago with my partner. However, constant lockdowns cancelled that. The film is still quite enjoyable, despite not too much happening in the runtime. It never gets dull. Again, dull was really a key word here, wasn't it? The focus on the underwater shots with a strong emphasis on using the score just adds to the film's constant fear, though still for this kind of 50s cheesy sci-fi attitude. It's just a fun, classic film that has an amazing creature, interesting and never annoyingly one-dimensional characters, and an overall well-shot feature. Constant fun and a constant favourite. Upon rewatch earlier this year in May, I gave it 4.5 stars. I said, I'm so happy, because this is actually I think I started watching the films and was like, oh, I should watch them all before I watch The Creature. And then I didn't do that, and I ended up watching The Creature, and all these months later, I finally finished watching the Creature films for the first time ever. I'm so happy that I finally got to see The Creature in 3D, courtesy of Acme. I was meant to watch it 2 years ago, but due to the pandemic, it was cancelled twice. But today was the day. I wore this shirt, went with friends and my dad. The cinema was decently full, and we got to use the modern 3D glasses. I've never seen it in 3D before. I know most of the Blu-rays have the 3D transfer. I just don't have a 3D TV or anything capable of using that. It has a similar 3D effect to Dial M for Murder, where it's like image depth over things protruding at you, but then it does still have some things protruding at you here and there. Same as the second film, which has an option to watch in 3D, but I, again, don't have a 3D TV, so I didn't watch the second one in 3D. Yeah, there's not too much to say. Obviously, there are elements of where the audience would laugh at the film, some deserved, some not so much. Like my favourite part where the gill man has been captured and he's just sitting there in a makeshift cage under the water, and just watching the humans waiting for his time to escape from his prison and attack. Like, I guess it's goofy for most people to see the creature just kind of sitting there in the water, just staring, but I'm like, this is like the creepiest scene of the film, because he's just sitting there staring, he's waiting, he's watching. All the other characters are kind of going about their thing, doing whatever, and he's just waiting. He knows that eventually he'll just be able to throw away that lock and get the hell out of there. It's great. Yeah, there are other occasions when people were being attacked or Kay was being kidnapped, led to some obvious laughter from its design. And that's mostly how modern audiences react to like pre-80s horror films. So sometimes you can't exactly go to a cinema and see an old movie and expect the people to take it seriously. But that's fine. I had no real grievances with it, because it's like I'm enjoying the film with them, but for different reasons. Overall, the experience was a blast. Outside of the expected cinema experience hiccups, people talking / laughing at inappropriate times, or the guy behind me accidentally hitting the back of my chair, but finally being able to view it in the cinema with an audience and in 3D, of all things, was just amazing. I'm so happy that I finally got this opportunity and to see my favourite monster in all its glory on the big screen. And last but not least, in the number one spot, not talking about any of the Abbott and Costello films, which by given the length of this film video, I might just do a separate video on the Abbott and Costello films, just a small little review, I think, because I still want to watch them. It's Bride of Frankenstein. It's the best one. It's like objectively and subjectively, it's my favorite of all the movies. It's the best of all the movies. It's the most visually creative. It's the most interesting. From 1935, directed by James Whale. My review from 2019 says, a tremendous film, sequel, and piece of gothic horror art. From the reinventive scripts, the humanizing of the monster, to the creation of the bride. It's fantastic. The set design, the music, the acting, and especially the cinematography and special effects, it's a masterpiece. This is a purely iconic film that's a must-watch for everyone. Tell me you don't love it after you've seen the tiny people scene. There are tiny people. There's so much happens in this movie. You're like, oh yeah, this is the one where the monster learns to talk from the blind guy and he becomes friends, and then the bride is created. It's like, but what about those tiny people in the middle of the film, in the little jars? It's bizarre. My review from earlier this year, the 5-star review, still said, it still amuses me how much the final 15 minutes are so iconic that you forget how amazing the previous 60 minutes are. Do you remember the jars full of a tiny royal court, the monster rampage of the town, the relationship between the monster and the blind man? Yeah, I remember that part, but I usually forget the rest given the impact of the ending. It's just so imaginative and perfect. And, yeah, that's the Universal Monsters list. That's all 29 movies that I watched in this big ass review that's gone for over 2 hours, more than likely. Yes. Honestly, I'm just gonna kind of cut it here because I'm tired and it's been a long enough video. I don't know who's been watching this on Halloween, but this is my Halloween video. Happy Halloween, kids. Yeah, here's some real horror for you. Monday morning, you gotta watch a goddamn 2 hour long review of fucking 29 movies. Anyway, this is the best way I figured I could do it rather than just listing them and just saying, this is good, this is bad, this is good, this is bad, you know. I would suggest getting the classic monster set, watching the films, watching the not the commentaries particularly, but the extra documentaries that they feature for a lot of these films. Some of them might feature John Landis. Be very afraid. But yeah, for the most part, these are all fantastic films, worth watching wholeheartedly, especially if you're into horror, classic movies, black and white cinema, fucking Lon Chaney, I don't know. But yeah, would I have any particular listing of franchises? I'd probably pin maybe the Creature, probably Invisible Man films at the top, followed by Creature, Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman. Wolfman just lacks because it has She-Wolf and Werewolf of London, and they're not very good films. And given how the rest of his films outside of his solo one are combinations, it's not really worth mentioning. Yeah, the Dracula ones are really good. Frankenstein, a lot of them aren't great. I mean, it's just Sun that isn't that good, but the production design is still fantastic. Ghost isn't fantastic, but then from then on you get the combination films, and that's just, it is what it is. It's a different avenue when you're combining the separate films and then the combination films. But, I mean, it starts so strong with Frankenstein and Bride, but then the Invisible Man films are all their own thing, you know. He doesn't pop up in anyone else's film until the two Abbott and Costello films, which is one, a cameo at the end of the Frankenstein one where he's actually voiced by Vincent Price, which is great. And yeah, then there's I think they meet the Invisible Man as well, don't they? Yeah, they meet the Invisible Man, the Mummy, and Frankenstein, which has Dracula and the Wolfman in it. Anyway, that's the whole kit and caboodle. Thank you so much for watching. If you did, feel free to like, share, and subscribe for more. And I'll see you next time. Next Halloween, we're gonna watch. Fuck knows. See you later. Adios.